North Dakotans, are you ready for your smart restart? Man, I know I am. Kevin, my guest, Senator Kevin Cramer. Kevin, I need a haircut. Not that that's the most important thing in the world, but I look like a hippie right now, and that is not a good look for me. So, middle-aged balding men should not have long hair, I think.
Well, either that or you get a ponytail, then
no,
cool again. But,
no, that's a terrible idea.
So you think you need a haircut? Just think of the person who cuts your hair. Think how badly they need some work and some. They need my
$20 to.
That's it.
I get my hair cut in a hardware store. That's I do. Home of Economy in Minot. That's where I get my hair cut. We got a barber shop in the store that I used to manage. I used to manage the Home of Economy in Minot, and I brought the barber there. He's a great barber. He cuts my hair. That's where I get my hair cut. And man, am I looking forward to seeing him.
Well, and he must do a good job if he's still there. So that's cool.
Do you feel that? We're going back. People are. Governor Burgum's kind of getting it from both sides right now. There's some state lawmakers in North Dakota. I interviewed our mutual friend, Representative Luke Simons from Dickinson, who was saying that he was going to reopen his barber shop. He was going to reopen today, and he didn't care if he was going to have to pay a fine, or he wasn't going to pay a fine. Sure. So it's his right to open his business and to operate. So he's getting it. He's using some words like tyrant and dictator to talk about Governor Burgum, which I honestly think is a little unfair, more than a little unfair. But then on the other side, you have, there's letters to the editor, and, you have the North Dakota Democratic Party and that, and they're coming out and they're like, Governor Burgum's putting us at risk. And, so he's getting it from both sides right now. Do you agree with the way Governor Burgum's handled this? Like, do you think he's handled, the state of North Dakota well through the pandemic?
Personally, Rob, I don't know how he could handle it better than he's done. And the two sides you talk about, of course, and I love Luke, but he clearly takes a very strong libertarian, very conservative position. And by the way, I have his positions right legally. The Democrats, of course, we know what's happened to them in North Dakota. They love tyrannical, heavy-handed guns. So I'm not surprised, but it's the governor's job, who's elected, to manage it in the middle. The thing about Governor Burgum that I think is interesting, I've done a lot of national interviews where the fact Dakota never had a stay-at-home order comes up because they're curious about it. Usually it's a CNBC or Fox Business or somebody out in Wall Street Journal, and they come from New York or Washington, and they view us out here, and they say, how can you possibly not have a stay-at-home order? And I think it's two things. One is that Donald Trump has executed responsible federalism better than anybody. He understands cooperative federalism. He's provided these federal guidelines, and they're guidelines because they're not, they're not mandates.
I got to stop you there, because if we're going to praise President Trump for federalism, we have to look at his actions, not his words. Because his words certainly have not at times been the words of a federalist, where he's talking about the presidency having absolute power and some of these other things that he said. I mean, obviously, you don't agree with that.
I don't agree with that, and but I do agree with his actions. Actions have demonstrated federalism. Now, he's had some arguments with some governors and some of his more extreme language, but he has given governors pretty wide range with these federal guidelines to execute them in the context of their own state. And I think Doug Burgum's done exactly that as well as anybody. But here's what I really love, and Luke is an example of this. And as I often remind you, while we are federalists, while cooperative federalism with 50 states and that have created a federal government, or the federal government and the states are partners, we're self-governed. Our real exceptionalism isn't even it's in our self-governance, and that's why I've always said, frankly, the people side this alongside, at the very least, are officials, because the people are going to determine when they get out and about, when they congregate, especially when it comes to gatherings, because the freedom to assemble is such a fundamental, critical right in our country, and private business can pick pretty much their own rules within the broader scope of the law. So I think Doug Burgum's done an excellent job. And what he's done really well, Rob, and I think this is what's really important, is that he's communicated well. And when you communicate well, I think it was Abraham Lincoln that said, you can trust the people, give them information.
Yeah.
And he's done that. And then the people are willing to compliant, other than Luke.
Right.
So,
well,
and Luke's, I think, well within his rights not to be.
Part of, and I mean, we're very careful to say that politics shouldn't be a part of the virus debate, and I agree. Like, partisanship shouldn't, right? We seem like, well, that's a terrible idea because it came from Democrats. Like that should be it. But in politics, in the larger sense, is sort of just the means through which we decide public policy, right? I mean, so it obviously, as a political matter, we were going to reach a point, I think, both in North Dakota and probably in across the country to varying degrees, depending on where you're talking about. I think we were coming probably close to the upper limit of how much people were going to take. Like, there was going to be a point at which people just weren't going to choose to comply anymore. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because sometimes we think about, well, we credit government policy, for doing this or for doing that. But a lot of times it's us complying with the policy. It's us choosing, saying, okay, well, this is a good policy, and for the most part, we're gonna comply with it. If the public goes rogue and just decides, we're just not going to do this. And I always use the example of North Dakota's use tax, right? When was the last time you paid the use tax? I've never paid it. I think Ryan Rauschenberger, the tax commissioner, is the only guy paying it. Because everybody just kind of thinks it's a dumb law. And so nobody pays the use tax in North Dakota because and how in the world could the government enforce it? And I think the same's kind of true. If North Dakotans had decided, listen, we're had enough with the quarantine, we're just going back to business. We don't have enough cops. We don't have enough National Guard members, nor should we even want to resort to that to try to enforce the law on that sort of a wide scale. So there's sometimes, and people forget about this, there's an upper limit to how much people are going to choose to do before they say, nope, I got to act in my own self-interest here.
Well, and generally speaking, and so the system works, while not perfect, your cop illustration. Our laws are largely enforced by ourselves, by our own compliance. Otherwise, you'd have a highway patrolman for every car on the interstate. And, we don't have that. So we really do rely on each other. And by and large, and in the case of a pandemic, by the way, I think it's probably the best illustration of how self-interest really does look out for interest, because you're not going to subject your community if the community is in danger of spreading a disease, and you're not, versa. So it works pretty well, short of just tyranny or something like that. So this is why I think the most important thing is good communication.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, you want to inspire people to make the right choice, and I've made this argument. I always think choice is better than force. If we could just get people to choose, make good decisions for themselves, then we don't even need a law. I guess it goes back. What did James Madison said? If we were all angels, we wouldn't need government, right? I mean, that's
right.
Obviously, we're not angels, and we do need government, some level of it. But choice is always better than force. So I think that's very interesting. Let's talk about
and common sense trumps mandates, and we're especially blessed, Rob, to live in a place where common sense is pretty prevalent compared to some other places in the country. And I realize that not every place is North Dakota.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in some places like New York, I mean, I love New York, New York Yankees fan here. Visited New York. Mm-hmm. I think New York's a wonderful place, wonderful people. Mm-hmm. But the way they live, I mean, they're packed in, man. I mean, those sidewalks are crowded. Those subway stations are crowded. They live shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow. It's a very different way of life from out here in North Dakota. So New York had challenges that North Dakota, in a lot of ways, did not. And that's just, two different ways of life. One not necessarily better than the other. It's just kind of a personal preference. But that put New York, and places like New York, more at risk than North Dakota.
No, that's right. Interesting. There's a state yesterday in New York, and the realtors in the suburbs are getting a lot of questions from on the island, living in Manhattan, for example, looking to move out.
Yeah,
various reasons. So that's their self-interest, which is going to have impact on communities, to say the least.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the federal relief efforts, because they've been in place. I mean, at least the Paycheck Protection Act and the expanded unemployment benefits and some of the other things have been in place for a while now. There was a struggle for access.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of confusion. There was a struggle, I know, like for unemployment benefits, even here in North Dakota. It's been a little bit of a struggle. Are you satisfied with the way that's getting ironed out?
Yeah, it's a great way to ask. Perfection would be preferred. I think those programs have worked quickly. They were conceived and debated and passed and then implemented. But they're definitely not perfect, and bumps along the way. And first of all, first thing that's unusual about a lot of this is that government worked so quickly, including, by the way, the United States Congress. And so with the Senate passing such major legislation quickly, and by the way, pretty bipartisan legislation, and to program and the unemployment insurance, the two hallmarks. Unemployment insurance, as Chuck Schumer calls it, unemployment on steroids, was really the Democrat paycheck protection, were designed to keep employers and employees connected. Republican idea, the two came together and they came up with basically the first 100 or so pages of the 880-page CARES Act legislation. Remember, we passed it on a Monday and the paycheck protection on a Friday, largely because there had to be a first day at some point. The knew that we had to get the money out the door to try to save as many employee situations. And the first day had its bumps and bruises, and then since that, continued to evolve. Even after the first $350 billion were lent out, and loaned out to many more smaller companies than larger. There've been some people might consider bad actors like the LA Lakers or franchises, but for the it's hit the target that it was aimed at. And the rules, however, have been changing, or at least the guidance, maybe not so much rules as the guidance, and trying to aim it even more and more at smaller companies. North Dakota's done a great job. North Dakota, by the way, has the most loans per capita of any state in the country in their first tranche at 1,102 for a total of over $1.5 billion. So, the average has been 140,000.
I suspect that might be because we have a pretty high percentage per capita of small businesses too. I mean, it's just
that's correct. In fact, 79% of the eligible payroll, according to Bloomberg anyway, in North Dakota has received loans. So it's kind of remarkable. And we can talk about a lot of reasons for that, but the biggest reason for it is we have really good institutions. We have I did 2 webinars with bankers and credit unions prior to the passage of the CARES Act. So we really were able, through our accessibility to them, to help prepare in advance, and that really put us ahead of the curve. But then we just have great associations and institutions, and even the Bank of North Dakota provides such good leadership is really important. With regard to unemployment insurance, our concern, and you might even recall that the day we passed the CARES Act, we had basically a 10-hour debate on trying to get rid of that unemployment insurance $600 per unemployed person stipend, if you will, but that more than doubles pretty much anybody's traditional unemployment insurance benefits, knowing full well that would create a perverse incentive. In doing so, though, we did, empower the Department of Labor to come up with rules. And of course, unemployment insurance is it is a state-run, state-managed program, and the state has a share of course, of the funding for unemployment insurance. In North Dakota, our agency, of course, is Job Service North Dakota. And so we really empower governors and the states to come up with the rules. However, with flexibility and a leaning toward grace when it comes to people who have COVID-19 specific concerns, like a parent that they have to care for. They are in high risk category themselves, or they have symptoms. So we wanted it to be generous that way, but it's already had the unintended, or maybe at least unintended on the part of Republicans, unintended consequence of a perverse incentive for people not so much to quit their jobs, because you still have to be let go in order to qualify, but to be available to come back to work. And now as we reopen the economy, you're going to see some of that take place where people aren't returning calls from their employers when it's time to come back to work because they're able to sit their dollars, whatever. And in North Dakota, that could be like $1,100 or more dollars per week by staying on unemployment insurance. So we failed on our amendment, but we did have the vote, put everybody on record. So those two programs have worked. In the case of unemployment insurance, perhaps worked too well.
Well, at $1,100 a week, I mean, you're putting an individual at above North Dakota's median household income. So, I mean, that's a not
and we have a pretty high median income. You're right.
Or at or above. I guess I haven't looked at the median income lately. Maybe it's 56. So anyway, pretty close to it.
Close to it.
You have been in a couple of areas fighting, for instance, making sure that relief can get to the oil industry, which I've seen some of the usual wags saying, a bailout for big oil. I mean, can you explain that a little bit? I mean, because that's what some of the people are saying, like, what are you doing for big oil there, Cramer?
Well, interestingly, big oil is not real happy with me because big oil rather likes what's going on in some respects, and not that it's
created some opportunities for them, really.
No question about it. I just yesterday I was watching CNBC, and one of the major oil company CEOs, who I know pretty well, he said, what we need is more consolidation in the industry. And of course, I sort of gasped. But he made my point for me, because what we don't need is more concentration. Now, free markets will create some of that, and sometimes that's appropriate. However, when it comes to a couple of things for sure, food and energy, especially when you're abundant in both, you ought to be able to, energy independence ought to mean something. And that energy independence will be lost if we don't take care of our smaller producers, not big oil, but small to mid-size oil, which is largely what dominates North Dakota's landscape. And so small and medium-sized companies have more debt than they have cash, highly leveraged. And of course, in North Dakota, you cannot make money on $10 oil, $20 oil, or even $30 oil. You literally can't. And so what happens is, if you concentrate all of that, which will be the logical outcome, if we don't provide, some funding tools and some debt restructuring ability for our smaller and mid-sized operators, what you're going to see is ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil and Phillips 66, and Chevron, and maybe one or two others, Occidental, buy up these smaller private companies, in some cases smaller public companies. And then the capital investment in the future is going to go to where it gets the best return. And that's not going to be the Bakken. That's probably not even going to be West Texas. That's going to be Saudi Arabia, or Russia, which is why Saudi Arabia and Russia are trying to crush us out of business. And there are no, quote, bailouts for the oil and gas industry. We were able to get some expansion of the Main Street lending program yesterday, which is, I think, that created a lot of news today, national news, where I'm quoted a lot, and I worked closely with Stephen Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary Brullier, the Secretary of Energy, and Jay Powell, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, to make sure that there's not a discrimination against oil and gas companies. And they expanded the Main Street program, which will help some of our companies. It's certainly not a silver bullet. It's not free money. It's bridge loan. It doesn't allow them to restructure debt, which I be working toward. I've been screaming at the large banks who have a strong bias against two industries: a strong bias against firearms and ammunition, and a strong bias against fossil fuels. And that their bias comes from pressure from their boards and their institutional investors who want to be the cool guys at the country club who say we need guns and we don't need fossil fuels. We should only invest in clean, green energy. Well, that's bias against legal commerce.
Right.
And so, I've been really outspoken on these.
Well, because I was going to ask about the guns thing too. I mean, because if you just, I don't like gun shops or whatever. Well, that's fine. You don't have to go into a gun shop, but it's really sort of as arbitrary as saying, well, I don't like chiropractors, and so we're going to exclude chiropractors from these. Like, okay, well, I mean, if you don't like chiropractors, fine, don't go to one. But, and I don't have anything against chiropractors. I'm just picking them out. But fine, don't go to chiropractor. But you can't just, they're a lawful business. You can't just, say, oh, well, we're gonna isolate them because we have a political bias against them. Listen, guns are legal, and not only are they legal, they are a civil right. So, and also the oil industry. You're all using the oil. Right? I mean, you may feel great at the country. I don't know how you got to the country club unless you rode your bicycle, which probably has tires on it that were also made from petroleum. So, get over it, pal. It's
not only that, but you're federally insured, right? And you are heavily regulated by the federal government. And these same banks love to come to Republicans. I've been able to play a lead role in a lot of this, but they'll come to us for all kinds of regulatory relief when Elizabeth Warren comes after them. But then they'll go and do things like, not just in practice, but in written policy, a bias against fossil fuels and, legal commerce in the form of gun manufacturers and ammunition manufacturers. And they just should not be allowed to do that. So we hold them to account for it.
It's interesting, shifting back to the oil question, it's interesting what you said about Saudi Arabia and Russia crushing oil. I had, and actually I'm doing the interview after yours this afternoon. I had some folks representing the Saudi government reach out to me, and they wanted to put one of their people, representative from their embassy, and the subscriber listening to this podcast, that'll be the next episode, probably coming out Monday. This will go up Friday. They reached out to me and they wanted to talk. And I think it's because you, Senator Kramer, have been coming after him a little bit and getting after him. And I have a big audience right in your backyard, and they'd like to tell this. And to be honest, I'm happy to listen. I mean, I'm never against letting them have their fair share. But I'm going to ask them some questions, and I'm going to tell them what you said, that the perspective of a lot of North Dakotans and a lot of Americans is that Saudi Arabia is out to crush our industry. What's your response to that? You guys have a state operated oil industry, and you are not afraid to use it as a cudgel, as an economic weapon against us. I'm going to ask them that question, and I'm interested in their response. I don't know what's the response they're going to give a podunk blogger, podcaster, but I'm interested, and I'm interested in the fact that they're reaching out, because I think that's a very it's an interesting thing. Let's put it that way.
Well, it is. I mean, you probably saw there's a story a couple of days ago on this very topic. I was, pretty prominent in our services committee, and not only have I spoken in legislation with should know, I have 2,500 American troops in Arabia right now. We have 3 missile defense batteries in our Patriot missile defense system that assets against incoming ballistic missiles from Iran. Missile system, THAAD system, which we did not have missile defense system at our bases in Iraq when Iran shot their missiles at us and bases in Iraq just a couple of months ago. We have to protect their oil assets, and we also escort ships that are now coming to the United States with a whole to Saudi, because we still import about half barrels of oil. Large companies that benefit from that Saudi oil. So it's do plenty of things for them, and so I'll be interested in their reasons. Now I've had long their minister, and these all relatives, the Crown Prince, and the president himself has talked to the Crown Prince. This is why they're getting the call. I'm intrigued by it, and Dakotans are, up to them.
Well, you'll have to listen to the episode on Monday.
I will.
It'll be an interesting thing. Your cell phone's been cutting out a little bit, so I apologize to the listeners. We'll try to get a better cell connection next time, or it must be just one of those things. They should talk to the Public Service Commission about their cell coverage or something. I don't know. Well, although I suppose they can't really regulate. Well, you're in North Dakota, right now. So yeah. All right. We'll get your
federal bill. industrial building, though, does create some disruption occasionally in cell service for. One thing we can talk about sometimes, maybe we can do it on Hardline. Works, but I know you have to get a hold of me, and that's not always easy.
Yeah, well, let's switch. Last question: Coal Creek Station. I have spoken to numerous people, from local people on up, who are saying that they are expecting next week that Great River Energy is going to say that they're either going to sell the plant or close it down once I think their current obligations to the regional power grid are up. Now, I don't know. My understanding, it's a very fluid situation. Maybe that's how they felt yesterday. Maybe they'll feel differently today. That's really up to Great River Energy, which is a private company, and I guess can do as they please. But there is a lot, and we've talked about this before, and it's a long time debate. And I don't know that we're going to reveal anything new here today. But I think the issues with coal are really starting to come home to North Dakotans. I think that there are going to be some real wake-up calls coming to people who have just sort of, I don't know that they've been tuned in, but, pretty soon we're at risk of losing probably 1,000, maybe thousands of jobs in central North Dakota if we lose Coal Creek Station. Maybe that's the first domino to fall. Maybe some of these other stations go next. I don't know. And I think also the reality of what wind could mean on our grid. The investment that's going to be required in transmission lines is going to be enormous. That's going to show up in our utility bills. That's going to show up in our tax payments. And, there's also the question of grid reliability. This is a very scary thing to me. And I say this obviously I like coal. I think coal's great, although I've always said that if we figure out a better way than coal, then fine. It should, horse and buggies were great until we invented the automobile, right? I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against technological progress. I'm not against the creative destruction of the free market, but that's not what this is. And I'm feeling trepidation. I think the coal plants have always played both in the economic, impact that they've had, the jobs that they've provided, but also the reliable and cheap electricity they've provided in our region have always been an advantage North Dakota has had, and I'm afraid that advantage is going away.
Well, it's not just an advantage for North Dakota. It's been an advantage for the states around that benefited from the low-cost, reliable, and energy from a resilient grid. So you're exactly right. Everything you've said, it makes perfect sense. The thing that exacerbates the problem even more is really cheap natural gas, which is a very good, effective, dispatchable baseload fuel, assuming you can get it. And in North Dakota, and of course, federal policy, which is the most egregious problem here. And that federal policy is the fact that about a third of the capital costs of every wind farm are covered by the taxpayers. So while your rates may not go up with a wind farm, certainly your taxes are paying for it. So why should they? I mean, the taxpayers are paying for it one way or the other, going tax subsidies.
What happens when those run out? Because the PTs, the production tax credit, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the wind subsidy.
That's right.
The production was supposed to expire. It got shoveled into an end of year bill last year. It got renewed. The wind industry said they didn't want it. They didn't need it, but yet somehow it magically manifested itself again in 2020.
Right.
So here we are. But the thing about that is, you get that you qualify for the credit, but the credit's not just for like a year. It's not like payments are just going to stop when it expires.
Right.
Your ability to qualify for it is going to expire, but it goes on for like a decade. What happens when...
It's 10 years. Yeah.
10 years, right. So what happens when that starts running out? Like 10 years hence, and we got all these wind turbines around, and their PTC credits are running out. They've been operating for 10 years, and they're, like you said, a third of their capital expense are covered. What happens when it runs out? What happens to our utility bills then?
Well, so to your point about resiliency of the grid, for example, wind or any fuel or any fuel that's intermittent, like wind is, has to be backed up baseload. And there are two forms. There's really three fuels good for baseload. Nuclear, which is you talk outs with the nuclear is not any more popular than coal.
No.
Coal.
We couldn't even. I mean, remember when the University of North Dakota was trying to just drill a test hole near Rugby just to test the possibility of maybe this would be a good way to store the waste left over from a nuclear plant. They couldn't even drill a hole that was never going to see any radioactive material put in it. It was just a test. It was a scientific experiment, and people came out of the woodwork to oppose it. So, yeah.
And in North Dakota, Pierce County, North Dakota is pretty common sense area.
That's not exactly Berkeley. Pierce County.
Exactly. Right. So you've got coal and you've got nuclear gas source that in abundance in North Dakota, and it's in great abundance in Pennsylvania. You can't get from Pennsylvania to north of New York because New York won't let the pipeline go through this, and so natural gas is not bridge fuel. Well, they never let them. It's not like we have a lot of options for good backup. So what for that in something like as intermittent as wind? The way you do it is you have gross graphic distribution, so the redundancy all over the place. Because a wind farm, let's say, has a nameplate megawatt, 100 megawatts. It can generate megawatts. Well, it's only good in the reliability standards to about 15%. Because the wind doesn't always blow. In fact, the wind oftentimes doesn't blow when it's really hot and when it's really, and so it blows a lot in the sort of mild, not when you need electricity. So it's really a problem to say the least. And the other thing that grieves me is that when coal goes away, the innovators go away. So you're talking about cleaning it up, carbon capture, utilization, storage, the scrubbers, the kinds of things that the coal industry, and by the way, over decades, gas emissions and pollutant emissions are far lower than they were years ago. And that's not because of the closure of plants, that's because that has been innovated by the industry. And so I'm with you. It's grieving a bit. We're still doing our best to try to save that plant and other plants, but it will not be the first one to close in North Dakota. Plant a few years ago.
No, but it's the big one. I mean, because it's the biggest. It's the biggest. It's the most efficient. I mean, that's the Babe Ruth of coal-fired energy in North Dakota. Yes. I'm always handy with the baseball analogies.
You're hot on the Yankees.
But so some of the ones that closed today, I mean, they were older plants. Maybe you could argue they were kind of marginal plants. Coal Creek's, there's nothing marginal. It's a hugely efficient coal plant. It has plenty of has plenty of life left, but for politics, right? I mean, that's what this is. But for politics,
I don't think it. Yes, but I don't think that this day or next decision would be made politically based as much as it's economical. But the economics are benefited by politics. And so the leadership at Great River Energy is making a policy decision based on not so much on politics as it is on now. To remembering the Great River Energy is a Minneapolis company.
Yeah.
No North Dakota. So they do sort of the different crowd, shall we say, a different culture. Well, it probably adds some pressure.
The most valuable thing, and I do not want to diminish the value of Coal Creek Station. It's a very valuable plant, but probably even more valuable is the transmission line, the DC line that connects Coal Creek Station to Minnesota. And that's sort of an undercurrent here of what's going on at Coal Creek is the wind industry wants to connect to that line. And here's what bothers me is Minnesota wants wind energy, but they seem to want all the turbines to be built in North Dakota. So where's the place we're going to have all these wind turbines all over the place? And listen, I don't that doesn't bother me. I know people get upset. We had the big fight down in Theodore Roosevelt National Park about the Meridian refinery and whether or not you could see maybe see a little bit of plume on the distant horizon from inside the park. I thought all that was a little dumb. So I don't get too up in the air about this, but I do. North Dakota is not Minnesota's battery. And I worry because in order to build the sort of wind power that you need, I mean, if you're talking about 15%, right? If the reliability of a 100-watt wind farm is only about 15, what did you say? 100 megawatts, only about 15 megawatts in terms of actual reliability, right? 15%. It's going to take wind farms,
Roughly.
Representative, more than 6 times, almost 7 times the capacity of a coal-fired plant to replace a coal-fired plant, spread all over the place so that the wind's always blowing somewhere, right?
Right.
That is a massive amount of wind farms. That's going to require a massive amount of transmission capacity to bring all of that energy to market. That's going to be built all over our state. Are we prepared for that? Do you think the public? Do you think the public understands that's what that's going to mean?
Oh, perhaps. But what do you do after they're built? To your point, this is why we have to be careful about these decisions. There's a lot to think about. Not the least of which is what do you do with a plant that was built before siting laws, and what do you do with all that rusty steel, and what's the obligation of the company to clean it up? And but just so I want to be clear about this too. Believe me, there are other states that would love the opportunity to generate that electricity with wind, because one thing North Dakota is, we're energy rich, but there are other states that have become energy producing states as a result of wind, which is why politically wind enjoys so much support. You know, before wind energy came along and before ethanol came along, Iowa was not an energy producing state. Well, now Iowa is an energy producing state with a lot of Republicans in Congress. Minnesota is now an energy producing state because they have a very big ridge of wind turbines called Buffalo Ridge, and there are a lot of places that would like to generate the electricity that will replace that Coal Creek station. It won't be just North Dakota. GRE does have a sunk asset in that direct current transmission line, and that does have value. But and this is why you're seeing some of the stuff, as you said earlier. You're talking to a lot of local people and as well as coal people and whatnot. There's a lot to consider, and it all needs to be considered by every player before a major decision like this goes away. Now, to your point about the rumors, or what you're picking up, is that they either want to close it or sell it. Selling it's not as easy as you might think either, because of course, first of all,
they're not going to sell that transmission line, so you're going to have to send the power somewhere else.
That's right. Plus, North Dakota's got the further complicating issue of we have 2 regional transmission organizations. Some of our utilities are members of the Midwest Independent System Operators. Others are part of the Southwest Power Pool. And this gets into both economics and engineering, and it's nerdy stuff, but it's because when the oil was booming, and hopefully we'll return to that someday, there is still a lot of demand just in our own state for more electricity. Right. So it's a very complex system, our grid system and our transmission and distribution as well as generation system. And there are a lot of people working on it, Rob, as you know.
I know.
And again, I'm with you.
I think people are seeing me as just completely anti-wind. I'm not.
No. Right.
I'm against the way we're doing it. And I'm also against that there doesn't seem to be a lot of long-term thinking going on. I think it's a lot of short-term thinking. How do we cash in on the politics and the subsidies and everything that are available now? And I guess 10 years from now will just take care of itself. But this is serious business. It's hugely complex, and I'm not sure. We need to be thinking more further down the line.
I agree. Now, there are a lot of people that are counting on technologies like storage, the batteries, that, for example, so that when the wind blows, when it's 60 degrees, the electricity is available when it's 80 degrees. Right. We'll see. But we're a long ways from that.
We are.
View, so.
And I probably we went about 15 minutes over our usual allotment of a half hour.
I'm glad. I'm happy to do it if it's helpful.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time, Kevin, as always. And the coal debate will continue as well. That's a nice thing about working in politics, right? It's a recession-proof industry. Right? There's always
it is that.
There's always something to shout at people about, I guess.
For sure there is. Even when you give out a whole bunch of money, somebody didn't get as much as somebody else.
Yeah, well, that's how it is. Kevin, thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you. Bye-bye.